Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it around me, it's tropical houseplants. Today I'm going to continue on with the plant review series. As always, this one time of the week I will upload a review series video, and today, as per requested from another video that I posted, we're going to be looking at a Hoya, specifically the Hoya behind me, which is the Hoya Polyneura, or the Fishtail Hoya, or I think sometimes called the Mermaid Hoya as well. One of the things I wanted to ask is, just before I dive into the video, if you've got a specific plant that you would like reviewed, that you think I might own, drop it in the comments down below, or if it's a specific species or genus of plant as well, like do you want me to do more Hoyas, do you want more philodendrons, anthuriums, monsteras, do you want things that are not aroids? I don't have that many things that aren't necessarily aroids, but do let me know in the comments down below. Right, for the people that have been here for a while, as always, I will have chapters down below, so click the chapter that you would like to go to and skip to that part. For the new people, welcome. Essentially just a bit of ground rules. This review series is always going to be biased to my opinion because I'm talking about my plant, in my care, in my conditions. I'm based in the UK and whatever that might mean. And I grow most things in my conservatory. So bear that in mind when you're looking at this review. And as I always say in most of these reviews, if you do already have this plant and you want to share your experiences, drop it in the comments down below. I know that a lot of people would like to see it. Let's dive into the first topic. Right, talking about background with this plant, and I'll bring it in a bit closer, and as always I'll have b-roll at the very end of the video, so if you want to skip to that as well to see some close-ups, please do. But you might be able to see here, and you can probably tell why this plant is called the Fishtail Hoya, and there you go, and you can see some of the new growth coming in just there. There's some new growth coming in there as well, and usually you'll get double leaves. A couple of the new growths that you're seeing with just the one leaf is mainly because I was a bit clumsy and I kind of snapped some of the leaves, which is a bit annoying, but you know, neither here nor there. But as always with these reviews, I will add a photo here from my plant care app. It's not going to be a beautiful picture, it's just from a plant care app, but you can see what this plant was like when I first got it. The title of the video will tell you how long I've had this plant. If I am not mistaken, I think this is either 1.5 to 2 years, but the title of the video will have it on there. For the eagle-eyed amongst you, you'll see that I'm growing this now in pon, but I'll touch more on that a bit more later when we're talking about accessories. But let me put this, I'm going to see if I can put it somewhere that you can actually see it. There you go, it's still in view and you can still see me as well. But some of the background on this plant was, it was one of the few Hoyas that when I was starting to get a bit more interested in Hoyas and the wax plants generally, that I really wanted to get. And I think most people would do for the same reason that I did. It's a very unique looking Hoya. A lot of Hoyas you might get where there's 2 leaves coming out from each node, but this one specifically, because of that shape and because of that mermaid shape, and I'll probably showing my age here, but growing up, and this might not come as a surprise to some people, but I was really into the Little Mermaid. So for me, this was great. I mean, for the people that have been kind of noticing around, I've also got merman on me in terms of tattoos, so strong connection with that kind of theme. But I couldn't find this Hoya really easily, and I'll touch a bit more about that on availability. But I think eventually when I did find it, it was possibly an eBay seller. I know these, at least at some point in the UK, came out differently, and again I'll touch a bit more on that and availability. But when I first got this plant, it was already relatively established. It wasn't, and I know some people, and I don't know if this is still the case in the US, do let me know in the comments down below if you are from the US. But I know in the US there was a long period of time when I was first looking at this where people could only get a single node cutting rather than a full plant. And I know that there can be some challenges with that, and I'll touch a bit more on that on the propagation side of things. But I was fortunate enough to get a large plant like this. I think it was called a Hoya Polyneura brocade, and I'll be completely honest, I haven't done an awful lot of research to see if that's a different type of Hoya Polyneura than maybe the standard one. I know that you do get some with some silveriness on the leaves. This is pretty bog standard and green. It's not got any silveriness on the leaves. It does get a tiny bit of kind of white flecks that are happening on the leaves, but nothing huge. And yeah, in terms of getting it home, it got established relatively easily. It wasn't a plant, or even a Hoya more specifically, that was particularly difficult as an established plant. I know, and I have heard the stories from a lot of people when they were getting single node cuttings of this. It did take a while to root out. It took a while to get big. And yeah, it's one of those Hoyas that I think if you can get a slightly fuller plant, as with most Hoyas to be fair, go for a slightly fuller plant because it just takes a while to kind of get going. And I'll touch a bit more on blooms on this one as well because I don't have a bloom section, because most other plants we don't necessarily get them for the blooms. Some people will get Hoyas for their blooms. This does bloom for me, and it has bloomed for me consistently since the first year that I got it. So as I was saying, it was an established plant. But peduncles on this is really interesting because sometimes they do the same thing that a Hoya Bella would do, where the peduncles will drop and you'll get new peduncles every time. Sometimes it will keep its peduncles. I've seen it do both, but I think the majority of the time it will drop the peduncles. Most of my Hoyas, I'll grow up things. This is definitely one that I like to trail. The leaves don't get any smaller or larger. I think, in my opinion, it kind of stays true to form. And the blooms come out for me consistently around, at least in the UK, around September, October time. Definitely one that you want to go and have a smell of the blooms around nighttime. And they are also not blooms that will have an awful lot of nectar that drops off them. Some Hoyas really do. And I'm thinking of my Hoya kerrii at the moment, which is laden with blooms. And I think there's some form of like a religious name to it. I don't know, with a common name, and it's something heart of something. And I can kind of see why, because the nectar that comes off, it doesn't drip off the blooms on the kerrii. It sticks on the kerrii blooms, and it goes a reddish color, almost a bit like blood. It is very kind of sticky, but this one doesn't drip, at least from what I've noticed. It does smell nice. It smells at night. It's a floral scent. There isn't a specific scent that I could say, oh, it smells like coconut or it smells like lemons. Lemons, if you want one that smells a bit lemony. The the Hoya linearis is the one that you want to be getting for that one. But I think enough about background. Let's move on to the next topic. So the next topic is, as always, speed of growth. And I will caveat this because this is the first Hoya that I'm looking at here. I'm not going to go on about how fast it is as a houseplant in general, because Hoyas generally will be slightly slower than the average houseplant in terms of growth. So I will benchmark this in terms of speed of growth based on other Hoyas, if I'm comparing it to other Hoyas. So with this one, I would say maybe my fastest growing Hoyas would be the Australis or the Australis Lisa as well. They are very consistent and they are relatively fast after they're established at popping out new leaves. Usually in the summer months, you'll get like 4 or 5 new leaves, depending on how big and established a plant is. In the summer, in the winter, you might get 1 or 2 leaves. This is almost comparable. However, it will slow down a bit more in the winter months. But it is a relatively fast Hoya, I will say this. And again, I can only talk about an established plant that I've got. I know the cuttings can take a bit longer, but for a Hoya, it's relatively fast and it is relatively consistent as well. The one thing that will delay it is pests, and I will touch a bit more on the pests in the pest section. But generally speaking, as a Hoya, relatively straightforward and relatively kind of fast for a Hoya. Moving on to ease of propagation. And this is the bit that I really want to dive into here a bit more. So I have propagated a few of these, and I'll tell you the way that I propagated it, and it was through taking a cutting. And this is the thing, you kind of generally, at least this is what I've done with mine, you kind of want to get two nodes out of it. So one node will be the part which will have the leaf or leaves, and I'll touch on that. And the other bit will be where you'll have the new roots coming through. And I think the way that I've propagated this is both in sphagnum moss and in perlite. Both worked relatively well. I did propagate this in a propagation box, which had got LED grow lights on top of it. So in that respect, it was okay. It took maybe a tiny bit longer than most other Hoyas to root out. But when it did, it is quite plentiful with its roots. At least it has been in my experience. Now, when I mentioned leaf or leaves, basically, I've done both because I wanted to see if I leave a couplet of leaves and the one node, would it grow any faster than having both of the leaves, so the actual fishtail and then the node, basically. I don't think when I did it, because it was a while ago now, I don't think it was any faster or slower. And obviously this goes on to the fact that a lot of plants, let me bring this up again and show you, a lot of plants, when you remove one of the leaves, especially if it's a couple, and it's trying to grow, or if you've got something that's a very large leaf, if you cut it in half, and it's very similar kind of concept to how you would propagate begonias sometimes. If you've got very large leaves, or if you've got a lot of leaves on one node, what will happen a lot of the times is that will take even longer to root out, because what you're doing is that cutting that has the stem and hasn't got any roots yet will be trying to keep those leaves alive without having the roots. So it's not using the energy where you want it to really use most of its energy, which is to root out and not keep the leaves alive. So yes, if you're going to be doing it, it might not look so great, but it might be one that if you've got a bigger one like this and you want to try that, or if you've already tried that, let me know down below what your experience has been with that. I didn't see much of a difference, but it was pretty standard in terms of how you would propagate any Hoya, really. Now moving on to availability for this plant, and again I'll bring it in and show you the plant up close a bit more so you can kind of see what I'm going to be talking about. I have got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, I think, growth points in this. And I've always had 12 growth points on this. The one thing I will say, it doesn't branch out easily in terms of the stems, even when you've taken a propagation cutting, essentially. So it's really interesting how the apical dominance works on this plant. But it is one that, when I was first getting it, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, there wasn't an awful lot of them available for a very long period of time. I think I've been searching for something for specifically the Hoya Polyneura for nearly a year before I actually found one. And I was, as I said, fortunate enough to get a relatively established plant. I don't think it probably had more than 4 or 5 leaves per stem, really. But yeah, it was relatively established. I got it on eBay. Price-wise, even back then, mid double digits, mid towards high double digits, I would say, when I first got it. And I think I got the first batch of a wave that came into the UK and Europe, I think, at that time, where there was a few established plants that came out into the market. I don't know if this happened anywhere else in the world, or specifically America, because I think I remember when I was mentioning this, I still got a lot of my American followers back then going, we can't get a full plant and there's only cuttings from other people. So hopefully that has changed and you can get a slightly more established plant now. But it came onto the market. The price was, well, I was mentioning, kind of mid to high double digits. I don't think that has drastically changed. And obviously when anything like this floods the market as a more established plant, you will get cuttings, both rooted and unrooted, on places like eBay. And I think that is still the case. Probably from a lot of the, I hate using the words common, rare, or anything like that, basically, but it's not the most common Hoya, so you won't get this in most garden centres or big box stores. You might get it at a plant store, at least here in my location. but it's also not one of the most difficult Hoyas anymore to find. So I would imagine, and I haven't checked this recently, but I would imagine the pricing would be mid towards low double digits, but still relatively more challenging than the average kind of common Hoya to find in a store. So you do need to do a bit of research and to dig around and see if you can find one, basically. But yeah, it's interesting because this is another one of these plants that I would love for it to become a bit more of a common house plant, and you can get it in box stores. At least in my experience, I haven't found this to be any more challenging than some of the more common ones. So, like the Australis or like the Crimson Princess or anything like that, it's definitely easier than the Hindu rope, for instance. But yeah, and I think there is definitely potential for this one. I would imagine with, as with most Hoyas, even more specifically in the way that this one grows, that this would be a particularly difficult plant to get shipped to you or sent via mail or courier or anything like that because so many things could snap. So if you do find something like this online, I would highly suggest that you come to terms with the fact that if you're going to order it online, it might come to you in several bits. But if that's the only way you can get one, as long as you're comfortable with that and you're aware with this, and as long as the plant store has done a good job of trying to keep it in one piece, because trust me, they will try, most of them will try to do a good job at getting it over to you. But I would imagine this is one purely in the way that it grows and how kind of fragile some of these stems can be. It might come to you a bit bruised and battered. It's still fine. It will still grow back. As I've mentioned, it's not a particularly slow growing Hoya. It's not the fastest growing Hoya, but you'll get it back to a stage where you like it. And also cuttings and propagations then, because even if something is snapped in the post with most Hoya, they're still relatively viable cuttings by the time they arrive to you. So do with that what you will. You can propagate and keep, or you can propagate and sell, or you can propagate and give to friends. Moving on to the glorious topic of pests with this one. Now, with this specific Hoya, I would say I've never really had any issue with spider mites. I've not had any issue with whitefly either. I've got some whitefly at the moment in the conservatory, which is causing me like lovely bits of headache. But that doesn't really seem to be attracted to this either. Fungus gnats, when I still had it in its own soil mix, and this is definitely, I didn't mention this earlier, but this is definitely a plant that I have not touched the root system. It's currently in pon, but what I did with the pon, it's obviously not sitting in a self-watering container, but what I did with the pon is I kept the soil still on there and I've surrounded it with pon and pon above and pon below basically, and I flush it like I would normally if it was soil. And it did take a beat to get used to that, but it's doing okay at the moment. But pests with this one, the major one is, as with most Hoyas, I would say, is mealybugs. And boy oh boy, you might not think that this has awful lot of nooks and crannies. It really does. Granted, it's not going to be as difficult to try to spot the mealybugs or manually remove the mealybugs as it would be, for instance, with something like the Hindu rope that I just mentioned a moment ago, but the Hoya compactor. But it still is something that you will kind of get going. And I've tried loads of different things on this. It wasn't working. The thing that I mentioned earlier on about the speed of growth is when this did have quite a few mealybugs on there, they didn't kill off the plant. It didn't even make the plant struggle visibly too much or lose any real leaves. It still bloomed. It did almost entirely halt the production of new leaves. And even though I was manually trying to take it off, it really didn't work for me. What did work for me with this when it came to mealybugs, especially now where it's a bit warmer and I'm behind the camera, is the outside of the conservatory essentially, and it's where I've got my garden hose. Taking this out and blasting it with the shower kind of attachment to the garden hose or the spray attachment, the same way that you would be knocking off aphids off garden plants, and do the same thing with this. As most Hoyas, it is a relatively rugged plant, so it can take some of that pressure basically, but it washes off a lot of those mealybugs. And ever since doing that, I'm still seeing some mealybugs have come back yet because I haven't got rid of all of them. I do have a sneaky suspicion that they might be in the soil with this one. However, and I know some people do this, that they will kind of unroot a whole Hoya and try to get any kind of root mealybugs out or anything that might be growing in the soil. At least from what I've seen, and correct me if you've had different experiences with this, everybody that I've seen that's done that ends up with a much smaller plant in bits, and some of the sections of the plant that they're trying to save do eventually die off as well. Hoyas really don't like their soil being disturbed too much. And as I've said, I think this has been going on with this plant for at least a year. It's still growing fine. It's still keeping its roots. It's still growing the way that it should be growing. As I've mentioned, when I was able to knock out most of the mealybugs on here, the new leaves started coming out. And as I did say, obviously, it's also the fact that we're now coming into the later bit of spring and early summer here in the UK. And that's obviously the time when most Hoyas will bring out new leaves. So it might be that as well. But yeah, I think the only real pest that I had with this plant is mealybugs. And I'll see if I can get, I did notice some when I was taking it down to show you a moment ago. I'll see if I can get some mealybugs in B-roll. And I do apologize. I think most people expect the B-roll to be these beautiful scenes of a plant, but I always do like to show warts and all with most of my plants. So if there is a bug that is quite common on that plant, I will show it to you in the B-roll, especially if it's on the plant at this particular moment in time. So yeah, let's move on to the next topic. So accessories with this one, and I've mentioned some things as we've been going along. Obviously, it is a trailing Hoya. Generally, most people would want to grow this as a trailing Hoya. I don't think I've seen anybody successfully grow it up, maybe. But then you lose some of the element of it being like a fishtail, basically. So I don't know why you would want to do that, because obviously the leaves would kind of move to adjust to that. So I don't know. But you definitely need a pot, obviously, that you can hang from. In terms of how I was growing it, even before I had it on kind of one of those hooky hanger, I don't know another word for it, a hooky hanger pot. It's one of those things that I think I was growing this in a pot before and I just had it on a shelf. So it was trailing off the side of the shelf. I had to put it in something like this because it was getting too forward heavy and I nearly lost this Hoya and it probably would have snapped most of the leaves off if it fell off a very tall shelf. But back then I was growing it in terracotta, and I know a lot of people are going to come to me about the terracotta thing, especially when it comes to Hoyas. A lot of my Hoyas that are not in net pots or are not in pond are in terracotta, and they have been for years, and they are very, very happy. So, and this, I'm not going to touch on it too much, and loads of other YouTubers have done videos on this, but you can still use, at least in my experience, terracotta with Hoya. You just need to soak the pot entirely with everything in it and the soil and everything like that. And when that terracotta is fully saturated, you can then usually bring out the plant at the same time. If it's just a standard, bog standard terracotta pot, for most of my Hoyas, if I'm struggling even slightly, I'll just take a hammer to the terracotta pot. I'll break up the terracotta further and I'll use it as an aeration mechanism, either for the soil, other house plants, or for the soil in my garden, basically. So I'm okay with that, because to be fair, most Hoyas will quite happily be in the same pot for a very long period of time. I know there's some debate whether or not you want to keep your Hoya root bound or not. In my experience, every single one of my Hoyas that's quote unquote root bound, and they're not even that root bound because the roots are so thin, do bloom more profusely for me than any of my other Hoyas. So take from that what you will, basically. But yeah, so pond, I've mentioned I've moved this into pond. Not enough self-watering with this one. Interestingly, with this plant, with this Hoya specifically, it does like the brighter light, like most Hoyas, but it does a lot better at the in-between seasons. So it's not particularly happy in the winter. It's not particularly happy in the height of the summer either, when a lot of other Hoyas are. But autumn and spring is when you really see this Hoya start coming into its own. I think, if I'm not mistaken correctly, this is from slightly higher elevations, so it does really appreciate the nighttime temperature drops. And I'm thinking back from when I was very, very young in Cyprus, and this would probably be a plant that could grow quite well. If you've got an environment like that, great for you basically, because you'd get very, very warm days and very sunny days, but the temperature drops considerably at night. And I think based on what I'm seeing with this plant, it is something that it does enjoy. Obviously, it's still a house plant, so you don't want the temperature dropping more than like to 15 to 10 degrees. I think 10 is the lowest I've ever got this at night, and that is Celsius. But yeah, it does really appreciate it. And I think that's also what triggers the blooming to happen for me in the autumn months. In terms of fertilizer with this one, as with most of my Hoyas, and this does not change whether or not it's summer or winter, I will water them with the same water that I would normally water everything else that is in pond. So it's always got a very, very weak solution of fertilizer within it. So, and I think I read somewhere about this, that it does, Hoyas are plants that do appreciate fertilization. They don't appreciate strong fertilizing happening every so often, but they do appreciate it kind of every so often. And to be fair, with most of my Hoyas, I do treat them a bit almost to the same level as I would treat a Phalaenopsis orchid, for instance. So yeah, but other than that, you don't need support sticks. It's going to be a hanging plant. There's the pond, there's the fertilizer, and as with, I've said this several times and I've got it in most of my videos, I use liquid gold leaf, and I've got a link for it down below as well. That's not sponsored, so I don't get anything from it. I just really enjoy using that fertilizer. But yeah, other than that, it's a relatively straightforward plant, really. So going into final thoughts for this plant. And I'll start with the usual one that I will always start with, and it is knowing what I know now. If I was to find this plant again, didn't own it, would I purchase it again? 100%. This is a no-brainer for me. I have not lost the love that I had for this plant since I've got it, basically. So it still brings me a lot of joy, and it might be because of that connection with the mermaid-y side of things. And I think that's something that a lot of people talk about. It's the connection that you might have for a plant. We all kind of lose interest in some house plants, but if there's a story or something that you can personally kind of relate into a specific plant for whatever reason, those are the ones that usually still keep a very tender place in most people's hearts, even years later, basically. For whatever silly or insignificant reason to other people, it is something that you'll have a bit more empathy. So yeah, definitely a plant that I would get again. As I've mentioned, it's not a particularly fussy Hoya. Now, giving it a score between 0 being the worst and 10 being the best, and I will benchmark this against other Hoyas first, and then as a houseplant in general. So against other Hoyas, I would probably put this between a 7 or an 8. As I mentioned, it's relatively fast growing. It's not a particularly difficult Hoya to kind of go in. Pest wise, yes, you do get the occasional mealybug, but no more than you would get with any other Hoya, to be fair. But yeah, relatively good Hoya. I would give it a relatively strong score against other Hoyas. Now, the same 0 to 10 as a house plant, and this might be something that I would kind of put against most Hoyas. I'd probably give this a 6 or a 7. And it's only because, and again, the people that have been here for a while will know this, I've got 0 patience. And this is a plant that it's still a Hoya. It's still a bit slower than most other house plants, even if it is fast for a Hoya. And I've only just realized in this video, and I apologize, I know it's the very end of the video, but I don't even know how many times I said the word Hoya throughout this video. So but yeah, I think a solid 6 or a 7 for this one would probably be okay as a houseplant. It's still a very solid houseplant, not particularly difficult. But yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to say about probably one of my favorite Hoyas or wax plants. But yeah, as always, I do encourage you, if you've got your own experiences with this plant specifically, drop them in the comments down below. I know a lot of other people might want to see that. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.